Let's get ready to rumble!
Oh my God! Unbelievable! Down goes Frazier! Down goes
Frazier! It's time! You're listening to New Mexico's only mixed martial arts and boxing podcast, The Low Blow, on AtomCombatSports.com and Fight Fans Radio. On this March Madness opening day, it is episode 183 of The Low Blow on Fight Fans Radio, USCombatSports.com, and SouthwestFight.com. I am Justin Goodrum, joined by Jorge Hernandez. What's up, man?
How's it going, man? Happy March Madness indeed. My favorite time of year.
It's 83-80 at the time of this recording of this podcast, St. Louis. Did you have St. Louis winning?
Jesus, no. I had them losing, and NC State messed that all up. I think I've lost 4 games. And then North Dakota State, I have in my Sweet 16. Looks like they're going down.
Really? I had that. My mom made that pick. She made her bracket, not to spend too much time on basketball, but she based her picks off of jersey color and on a team logo. She went 50% so far, but she has some interesting upsets, including Coastal Carolina beating Virginia for the first time ever, a number 1 seed going down. So we'll see.
Whoa.
Yeah. On today's show, probably, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jorge, in terms of a week and a half of big-time mixed martial arts news in Albuquerque, I don't think we've seen this big of a news invasion, to coin a phrase, of just all this news concerning the UFC in Albuquerque. Just an unbelievable kind of week concerning, the UFC coming to Albuquerque, Carlos Condit, and Holly Holm. So we'll break all of that down, and we'll review UFC 171, in my opinion, one of the best shows so far this year, a fantastic main event. Before we get into that, first, you can always get in touch with Fight Fans Radio through Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Ustream, and Spreaker. You can find our show on those outlets as well, along with Stitcher Radio, a couple hours after the live feed. Also, we're on Spreaker and on iTunes, and we're on YouTube, youtube.com/lowblow505. That, of course, has the Bob Foster interview, about 8 minutes long. Please go check that out. A fabulous interview about Bob Foster. If you do not know about Foster, a world champion boxer, a legend in the state, especially if you live in Albuquerque or if you live anywhere in the world for that matter, it's definitely a man you should know if you follow either mixed martial arts or boxing. Of course, we're always available through email, lowblow505@gmail.com, and of course through Facebook, facebook.com/lowblow podcast. I've seen a couple of comments on there. Keep them coming. We love fan interaction, so make sure your voice is heard through Facebook. And, of course, Twitter as well, at The Low Blow. So, man, our standing 8 count is going to be kind of Albuquerque-focused concerning the UFC. And we were discussing this kind of off-air within the last couple of weeks, man, just about something was up. We heard some radio interviews with Dana White, doing some local radio interviews here in Albuquerque. You stated Daniel Cormier did an interview here, and we both stated like something is definitely fishy, and there's definitely smoke in terms of the UFC coming to Albuquerque. Our suspicions proved correct earlier this week that the UFC is indeed coming here June 7th with the main event featuring Ben Henderson and I always going to screw up this guy's name. You're going to have to help me, Jorge. Ruslan, how you pronounce his last name?
Khabilov.
Ruslan Khabilov.
The Tiger.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so this is going to be the main event, June 7th. Unfortunately, they picked this day. I was supposed to go on vacation this day, but that's not happening. I'm going to be covering this show. But nevertheless, this main event is happening. So, Jorge, if you can, walk us through what really were the reasons of this event coming here, not only to Albuquerque, but also choosing Tingley Coliseum as opposed to the Pit or the Santa Ana Star Center that's about 15 minutes away from Albuquerque, that's in the city of Rio Rancho, New Mexico. Can you go into detail as how did this main event come about?
There's a few things. The Tingley Coliseum, it might not be one of the greatest venues in the city of Albuquerque, but it is one of the more, I guess, alongside the Pit, one of the more historic ones just because of the artists that have played there ever since, the 70s, 80s, and the 90s as well. It was a hotbed for boxing for a little bit, and ultimately that faded away as the venue itself went unkept. There has been a relaunch to, create to put a facelift on this venue. And Jackson's MMA, I think, can be thanked for a lot of this, just because their local events here, known as the Jackson's MMA Series, their home has been the Tingley Coliseum for the last 2 or 3 events, and they have done decently there. So with the job of Jackson's MMA, especially the general manager there, Ricky Cottonstead, doing these events, it went to show how that MMA would work there in the Tingley Coliseum. And, to top it off, there's alcohol that's allowed there at the Tingley Coliseum. We unfortunately don't have that at the Pit, which is run by the University of New Mexico, and it's historically one of the most recognized venues arguably in the entire world. I mean, Sports Illustrated had the Pit as one of the top 20 venues of the 20th century. So it does carry high merit, but when it comes to, mixed martial arts, the Tingley Coliseum is more of a hotbed for that than any other venue here in the state of Albuquerque. And as far as the venue in Rio Rancho, the Star Center, where Bellator has visited a couple of times, we saw the WEC visit there. What was it? The shark fights also that happened out there, if you might not remember that, about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So that definitely was a way to at least get some of these smaller promotions. But for the UFC to come to this part of the state, it had to be in Albuquerque, and it had to be at a centralized location. And fortunately or unfortunately, that is the Tingley Coliseum. So either way, I'm excited. I'm glad that it's not a full UFC, let's say 175 or something like that, just because they do need to test the waters. It's a smart move by the UFC to see how well they do in this, but they need to put native New Mexicans on this card for it to succeed, I believe.
Do we have an idea what the card looks like in terms of a co-main event and undercard? We've seen, even with this main event we'll discuss later on with Shogun, Dan Henderson, it's not the best undercard. Any idea which direction the UFC is going to go? Because we've seen Bellator basically align themselves with local gyms here and not really use Jackson's fighters too much. They've kind of used talent all over the New Mexican area, northern New Mexico. With the UFC, do you see them using a ton of Jackson's fighters and kind of ignoring the rest of the gyms here? Or do you see them kind of picking and choosing which talents they want in the undercard? Or do you think it's not going to matter and they got their main event, they know Albuquerque's a hotbed and they're just going to fill with the guys they wanted?
I think as of right now, they can do whatever they want, just because the fact that people are going to show up. I think for them to get 8,000 people on a weekend in that venue, if you set it up properly, can probably do up to 11,000. But, because of the size and because of how that venue looks, and especially because of the fact they're doing it on a Saturday, there's no excuse that 7,000 people can make this event. And it's typical size of what you see with the UFC Fight Night. So I think if you get 8,000 here, the UFC will view it as a success, especially if they don't have any local guys. I think either way it's going to do between 7,000 and 9,000. Rustam Khabilov, I don't think we mentioned this yet, but he is a fighter out of the Jackson's MMA gym. Obviously, he's not a native New Mexican or even an American. He's actually Russian. And it's a very interesting fight as well, just because of each guy's rank. You have Benson Henderson ranked number 1 in the lightweight division. Rustam's ranked 15th right now. So, I guess we can go in depth a little bit later of how, this does affect Henderson, but I think the most likely candidate to put on this card, Jay, especially for a fight night, would be John Dodson as a co-main event. Wouldn't you agree?
I was going to mention that name, took the words out of my mouth. Let's see if because I don't really know his fight status at this moment. He's always a weird one because his fights are kind of under the radar. Let's see here. Let me look it up here real quick. Because you're right. I think that'd be a fantastic co-main event.
He was supposed to fight recently. He got injured so that he was taken off of the card. So as of right now, as far as I know, he's opponentless right now. So if he can hold off, another little more than 2.5 months, I think it's definite possibility. And I know it would be something that he'd love to see. Also, another guy that people haven't thought about, maybe he can be the main event, but Donald Cerrone. Donald Cerrone really wants on that card, and despite the fact he's not a native New Mexican, he's lived here for a good 6-7 years and lives just outside of Albuquerque. He owns a ranch here. A lot of people have leaned toward him, meaning the fans here, just because he does tend to represent the area and kind of lives the area that he's from too. The cowboyish out in the rural part of the city, just outside of it. But if you put this main event, which I think is a really good main event, because Rustam Khabilov, I can guarantee one day he will be champion of this lightweight division. It might not be now, but this is an excellent start. If Rustam were to win this fight, he would just skyrocket as far as these rankings. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes up to as high as number 3 or number 4, currently ranked 15th, if he were to pull up the upset. And I honestly don't think it'll be that much of a upset, just because of some of Rustam's stand-up is good. His sambo is incredible. And I'm excited for this main event. It's the rest of the card can be an okay card, but I'm excited about the main event. They did give us a former champion is always a good thing.
Well, yeah. This is a very similar situation to what Tyron Willie was with Carlos Condit. Only it's in reverse with Ruslan. If he beats Ben Henderson, that puts him, almost immediately in line for a title shot. You mentioned his ranking that immediately skyrockets him. Benson Henderson, even though he's kind of on a rough stretch here in his career, still respected, still a opponent to take seriously. With Ruslan getting his victory, this would be huge for him in his career. In terms of hype, I've noticed that the news community is taking this event fairly seriously. Albuquerque Journal broke the story. There's reports on, I believe, Channel 13 here in Albuquerque, and then Channel 7, KOAT, ABC. They had a bit of a profile piece. They had Ricky Casanet on there talking about the event. So they made it seem like the UFC was primarily brought to Albuquerque because of Jackson's MMA. That was kind of the angle of that story from Channel 7's perspective. I guess in terms of fight week, I guess we don't know any of the specifics. June 7th, you mentioned, Jorge. That is a Saturday. So pretty much it's going to be kind of like a test run. It's going to be kind of like a pay-per-view here in a lesser fashion. You'll have your weigh-ins on Friday. You'll probably have some kind of a press conference on Thursday. We'll probably see some kind of an open workout. I'm sure it'll be at Jackson's gym or some other gym locally here on Wednesday. Is that what you think the events will kind of unfold if you're kind of predicting things here?
I think so, man. I love the fact that this fight especially is happening on a weekend, and we haven't seen this big of a fight in Albuquerque in a while. I shouldn't say fight, just event in general. The WEC was a pretty big deal, and that had a decent amount of people show up. I think a little more, between 3,000-4,000. The last big event to take place at the Tingley Coliseum, I don't think many people have pointed out, but Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. fought Ray Sanchez III there at Tingley Coliseum, and that event did a little over 6,000 fighters. Jay, this card had Jorge Arce on it, former world champion, Ivan Calderon, who was a champion at that time, and had Mike Alvarado, future champion at that time. So that card, people don't realize it's likely one of the greatest cards to ever take place in the city of Albuquerque, MMA or boxing, just because of, one, the current champions at that time, the former champions, and the future champions that all fought on that card. It's just an unbelievable card. I remember that it was pretty good atmosphere there, but listen, the UFC is one of these. It's a good thing. I think you're definitely going to see one of the Mexican fighters currently in the UFC gym on there. They're going to try to, to benefit from the Mexican demographic that showed up to that Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. fight. I mean, it's not to say that all those fans are MMA fans, but they're going to try to play that side of it. Turning into a fight that that can show up, and that's why I think it has so much potential. Put a couple of those Mexican guys on there from Jackson's, and I think you'll have a good 7,000-8,000 people. If that event did a little over 6,000 people, this one has no reason to do not do between 7 and 9.
Agreed, and it's a lot of hype. I mean, this is a big time fight promotion. No disrespect to Bellator. But, the UFC is it's the Coca-Cola of mixed martial arts. And considering the connection that Albuquerque's had with the UFC, this has been kind of a story and kind of a relationship between the UFC and Albuquerque. And most of all, UFC and New Mexico has been kind of brewing within the last, I dare to say, ever since 2005 with Diego Sanchez on The Ultimate Fighter. In terms of fighters rumored, so you mentioned John Dobson. You got to put Leonard Garcia in there. You got to put Tim Means, possible, depending on his legacy contract. Damasio Page, and Diego Sanchez if he recovers from his injuries from the Miles Jury fight from earlier this week. Certainly, if you have half those guys on there, Donald Cerrone included, I think you'll get a sellout. I would not be surprised if they promote it correctly. I expect close to a sellout to this event, Jorge. I know that might be a little bit too much expectations, but just with the name brand and with the local fighters here, if done correctly, and especially with the main event, and you have all the people traveling from Arizona. I mean, this is a pretty...
El Paso. Don't forget about the El Paso market.
Good point.
El Paso market and the Phoenix market has been starving. There are a lot of people in Phoenix pissed that Albuquerque got a UFC before them.
I bet. And don't forget, Benson Henderson, he's from the Arizona area. And so you're going to have a lot of people from the Arizona area.
Great point.
Make that travel here. I expect a sellout. I'd be shocked if it's not a sellout or very close to it. 9,000 people. I'd be very surprised just because of the media attention this got. It picked up very well locally here. Unless something insane happens, even if the main event falls out, if you have the local fighters, in terms of a local event, I'd be fairly surprised if this event does not sell out. I think it's a no-brainer. I think it's
more than I definitely did consider that.
No doubt. If you don't mind, let's transition to the second biggest story, and that is concerning Holly Holm. She's been in negotiations with the UFC. I guess her management has ever since last week. It started with Dana White at the media scrum at UFC 171 stating that I guess her management, Holly Holm's management, was in Dallas to negotiate with Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta. From the event, from the press conference, what we heard is that I guess Lorenzo Fertitta talking to Lenny Fresquez. And this is what Lenny Fresquez had to say from the meeting here. Basically, this is a quote from him. "This is a super fight," he said, and this is concerning the Ronda Rousey fight, Ronda Rousey versus Holly Holm. He continues to say, "This is the biggest women's fight in the history of any type of women's combat sport. It takes a lot of money involved in this payday. I want to make sure that Holly gets her fair share." And of course, Fresquez met with Dana, Lorenzo, and Sean Shelby at the American Airlines Arena. The story broke on MMA Junkie a couple of days ago. He said offers went back and forth. We already had guidelines of what we're going to agree on and what we weren't going to agree on. We're still a little ways apart, and there's still a couple of items that they're kind of further apart. He says, "We're excited about getting Holly into the UFC. It's my job to put Holly in the right hands." That's basically what he said. Here's kind of the negative part. So if you read that story, I think you would say the meeting went kind of well. But according to UFC Tonight, that's not the case. Basically, Ariel Helwani stated that the meeting between Lenny Fresquez and UFC did not go well. This is basically the quote, "not interested whatsoever," unquote. That is a direct quote from Dana White. So, okay, Jorge, we discussed this, ad nauseum for years, about how if you want to play the money game with Dana White, you're going to lose. And you see the ramifications with that right here. Compared with Guillermo Melendez, where A, he fought in the UFC, B, he was a champion of Strikeforce, and C, put on a Fight of the Year performance against Diego Sanchez, he had a little bit of leverage. With Holly Holm, she has none of that. If we were running the UFC, Jorge, I think we easily would pay her $1 billion and she'd be in the organization. But with Dana White, consider his perspective. Number one, Holly Holm's never fought on pay-per-view recently. Number two, in terms of her being a draw here in Albuquerque, she draws decently, but she's never ran the pit to my knowledge. Has she ran Tingley Coliseum? Holly Holm in the main event? Okay.
Not as far as I know.
No main event there. No main event sitting in a Star Center. No big time event for her as a draw. And then also in terms of her competition in MMA, you can say in Dana White's perspective, she hasn't fought anybody, even though she's 6-0. So in Dana White's perspective, I mean, even though she is a world champion boxer and deservedly so, I mean, he probably, in this perspective, is probably like, why am I signing this girl that's unproven commodity in terms of a draw and as a fighter? So what's your thoughts on this? Do you think Dana White's nuts? Or do you think he has kind of a point here with Fresquez? Do you think Fresquez is forcing the issue too much? What's your opinion on this?
I think we saw this coming from a long way. We knew Lenny Fresquez was going to get involved and potentially be either the gatekeeper to Holly Holm or either the backbreaker to everything and everyone's wishes of seeing this super fight. And it happened. I think, he goes into these meetings, and we don't know what happened.
Sure.
Lenny says one side of the story. What it kind of seems like it happened is Lenny got what he always wanted to tell Dana White off his chest, and he was happy about that. And Dana White did not like that at all. This is what this seems like. Fresquez, again, he's been a boxing promoter for several years. He's done some MMA events as well, but he's always been the go-to guy. He's in the position where he's not the guy running the show when it comes to the UFC. And anyone, moving into that kind of position, they can be uncomfortable or, maybe make some demands that might not be met. But before in interviews, we've heard Lenny Fresquez say, Holly Holm is bigger than Ronda Rousey. Holly Holm is bigger than the UFC. And we know that's not true, Jay. I mean, no one is bigger than the sport of the UFC within the sport. It's just too difficult to top that. And I think when it comes to coming in with a promoter mentality, especially in the sport where it's dominated by promoters like boxing, Dana White doesn't take too kindly to that because he's used to running the sport with an iron fist, and when someone comes in making demands, he's not going to take it well. And he didn't.
No, and that's a good point. I mean, with any promoter where you're talking about with Top Rank, with Golden Boy, I mean, if you try to use the intimidation method of you demanding, certain demands or your requests are outrageous, that normally does not go well. And that's with Dana White. I mean, Dana White is not a, normal commissioner or president of the league. He's not David Stern. He wasn't a lawyer. This guy was a bellman. This guy was raised in the mean streets of Boston. I mean, I'm not saying this is some kind of tough guy here, but, he's very hardened. I mean, this is not a man trained in negotiation. So with Dana White, when you try to challenge this guy's ego and try to challenge, okay, Holly Holm's the biggest thing of all time, that's going to be a huge problem. In terms of Holly's options, so let's say the UFC is definitely off the table, which I'll get to in a second. But let's erase the UFC off the board here, and let's say she wins her fight in a couple of weeks at Legacy. She wins, she destroys her opponent. In terms of her future, in particularly in Invicta, I have a point here made by Philip Lujan, who made a really good point, and something that we totally forgot about was Lauren Murphy. She is the 135-pound champion in Invicta. She beat Miriam Nakamoto. If you remember that fight, despite the pay-per-view problems, Lauren Murphy looked pretty good. She really overcame some adversity, and she won that fight. Even though Miriam, unfortunately, she kind of tore her ACL the same way that Carlos Condit did. It was a very similar fight in the way that played out. But Lauren Murphy was winning that fight before the unfortunate injury to Nakamoto. With Lauren Murphy being the champion, also you have Cyborg in Invicta. Is that a promotion that Holly Holm should look at? I mean, for Fresquez, I'm sure he cannot demand these huge money prices for Invicta, but at the same time, Holly fighting in Invicta is a much more bigger platform than Legacy, even though Legacy has a TV deal, don't you think?
No, I completely agree with you. It's just, to me, it makes more sense to fight with Invicta. I mean, who is Legacy going to throw at her? It seems like Legacy, a lot of these fighters, they're just bringing her to her at the last moment. They have no popularity behind them. They have not so great experience. I mean, tell me, out of all the fighters that Holly Holm has fought, do you say, oh my God, she has her on her resume? It's
true.
It's going to be very difficult. Holly Holm is coming off of the pedigree of these highlight reel knockouts that she's having against subpar competition and because of the pedigree she carries from her boxing career. But like we talked about last week, she's getting older. I mean, she's almost in her mid-30s, and the time for her to get into the UFC, that the time is now. And unfortunately, that's going to be the pass. And, you mentioned girls like Lauren Murphy. I mean, why not try to go to the UFC, try to go to Invicta, win that type of fight here somewhere down the line, and then maybe UFC at the beginning of 2015. From reports that I was reading, it seemed that the UFC wanted to sign her to have her make her debut at the Albuquerque event happening here in June.
That'd be really smart.
Lenny Fresquez felt that was too much pressure on Holly Holm to debut in front of her home fans, and I think that is a huge disservice to Holm that he's actually committed. Agreed.
That's a colossal mistake. That is, if that is in fact true, that's a colossal mistake. Because with Holly, I don't know. I'm going to try to choose my words carefully. But in my opinion, that's a huge mistake. And I think he's overestimating how much Holly Holm is a draw in combat sports. And I think really the management needs some kind of report on really how popular she really is. Even in terms of Albuquerque MMA fighters. I mean, you take a look, I dare to say, in terms of the fight world, in terms of who's going to be able to attract the rating, I would say, John Jones is number one. Donald Cerrone, Carlos Condit, I put John Dobson ahead of her. I mean, there's many other fighters I put ahead of Holly Holm because she hasn't been exposed yet. It's not Holly's fault. She hasn't fought on the main stage yet compared to these other guys. That's a huge mistake. And you make a really good point, Jorge. As Dana White has said, and it's cliche, but it's true, you have a limited amount of money to make as a combat sports athlete. I mean, it's not like, in other sports where you play in the NBA for 12 years and then afterwards you can play overseas like Allen Iverson, or you can, play football for some many odd years and then move on. In the fight game, you only have so many fights. And if you don't maximize that time, you don't get it back. There's nothing you can do. And I'm right on the money with you, man. I just feel that's just a major mistake. Because if you take a look at the depth of that division, I think with Holly, I'm sure they're not going to give her a insane opponent. I mean, she's not going to be fighting Misha Tate. She's not going to fight Liz Carmouche. Alexis Davis, I think she's tied up. Jessica I just got done fighting. I'm sure she's going to fight someone lower in the weight class. And I just feel like you were saying, man, that's a huge mistake. I just hope Holly, even though she has a management team, it's her responsibility to take control of her career. I mean, she's a big girl. She's very smart. She's very knowledgeable. She's very savvy. It's up to her what she wants to do. And my worst fear is that we end up 2 years from now saying a deal did not work out, and then let's say Holly loses a couple of fights, she ends up in the UFC, and it's too late. That's my worst fear. And I just hope ultimately that she ends up in the UFC at the right time to make the most amount of money possible. That's a scary thought. But I guess we'll see. Anything else you wanted to add, man? Hopefully, you do see Holly in the UFC someday.
No, and it's just a shame because if Holly Holm were on that card, it would do 9,000 for sure, man.
Yeah, easily. The third story is, of course, Carlos Condit, and you have news of that, Jorge, in terms of his injury. We'll break down the actual fight a little bit later, but this is huge news because with Carlos Condit's knee injury, it's some bad news confirmed by a follow-up exam.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate just because people did miss the fight this weekend. He has a torn ACL and a partially torn meniscus. So it's very disappointing to see Carlos Condit actually go through this. So the preliminary diagnosis of it did mention, again, a torn meniscus and a torn ACL, and it showed. So that was confirmed in a follow-up exam. And again, this is according to several reports and representatives from the camp. So Greg Jackson also confirmed it, same to the MMA Junkie who originally reported this, but it was halfway through that second round, I believe, where he did get kicked on the opposite knee, and he did land awkwardly on that right knee after getting kicked on the left knee in a fight that he may have been losing, but you never know what would have happened later on. But just a freak injury that that happen, and sometimes it does happen. Usually, you see things like this happen in practice more than an actual fight. But it was, I hate people to say, well, he wasn't really stopped by Tyrone Woodley, but Tyrone Woodley did land the kick that eventually led to the injury. So a speedy recovery to him, but I don't think we'll see him fighting for maybe another year, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's really too bad. And we'll break down the fight later on. But we do have some boxing news, and that's concerning Alfredo Angulo. We discussed this last week against his bout with Canelo. There's been some talk that he might have thrown the fight. Do you have some more information on this, Jorge?
Yeah, Alfredo Angulo is denying that any notion that he may have taken, a dive last weekend against, a couple of weeks ago here with Canelo Alvarez in a bout that many felt that Alfredo Angulo could have been more competitive in. He was reluctant with his punches, but he did put those rumors somewhat to rest by saying that he didn't throw the fight. But if you were a fighter and you did actually throw a fight, you would probably want to do the same thing. So Angulo did dismiss any talk and did say, and I quote, "To all of the people who think that I was paid off, I've told you before that Perro," of course mentioning himself, his nickname, "is not for sale. We started a little different. We started slow and plan to increase in the end, but we never reached that point. Unfortunately, I wanted to close hard in the later rounds when we already know that Canelo is always tired. But unfortunately, what happened. And controversy. And of course, he's referring to what many feel was an early stoppage in the 10th round of their fight. But Alfredo Angulo, if we've seen him before, we know this was his biggest payday. He got an extra $100,000 just because Alvarez was half a pound off of his weight. For someone to say he threw a fight, I don't know. He took a pretty good beating for throwing a fight when he could have easily just faked a knockdown or faked a TKO there. But nonetheless, I think people are more disappointed that that he did impose a bigger threat to Canelo, despite the fact that it was a decently, an okay fight, exciting one at least.
Mm-hmm. And some other news to wrap it up. Looks like Frankie Yeager and BJ Penn will headline Tough 19 July 6th. Get this, Jorge. So for the first time, I think, ever, a UFC, July card is going to have two events happening that weekend. You'll see first UFC 175 take place the day before June 5th, and then June 6th will be the Tough 19 finale featuring Edgar versus BJ Penn for the third time. There's an unbelievable weekend, part of International Fight Weekend in Vegas. It's going to be an insane week. If you happen to make it out there, no shortage of fights. This fight in particularly, very interesting considering this might be BJ Penn's last fight, but how many times we said that, man? But nevertheless...
It's like a Too Short album. He says it's going to be the last one for the past 10 years, but here he comes with more and more records.
Yep, exactly. So, man, real quickly, 2 rounds. I know we spent a lot of time talking about, Albuquerque and the mixed martial arts. Anything else you wanted to kind of express your feelings on this week?
I think my rant will come when we discuss the Danny Garcia fight.
Okay. I guess with me, it was real quickly, there's some pay-per-view numbers. It seemed like UFC, I believe, the card featuring Ronda Rousey and Sarah McMahon did unexpectedly well. I believe 340,000 buys, which is pretty good considering the disaster that we've all predicted leading into that fight. UFC 170 did better pay-per-view buys than UFC 169. UFC 169 did about 230 buys, which I think is a little bit better than I thought. That was, of course, the card featuring a double title fight with Renan Barão and Jose Aldo.
You know what? I love the number. That's a lot of boxing pay-per-views would kill to have something like that. Let's not forget I'm trying to think. That might be the same number that Timothy Bradley and Juan Manuel Marquez did.
Really? Wow.
I believe so. I believe it on the cells. And for Ronda Rousey to be able to do that just goes to show how many star power there was. And what do you know, Jay? I just looked it up. Bad left hook. Juan Manuel Marquez and Tim Bradley reached 375,000. That is phenomenal for Ronda Rousey to be doing those numbers.
It is, and keep in mind that card was decimated. Basically, that was a one-match show, and really that was with no promotion of Sarah McMahon, and now it's with the co-main event falling apart, and that still did that number. So I think the UFC should be very proud of that. And it'll be very interesting to see in terms of where Ronda Rousey goes from here in terms of her career. But I wanted to ask you, Jorge. I saw an interview with Herb Dean. I know you've been unhappy with him the past couple of months with his stoppages of Uriah Faber and of Sarah McMahon. The Faber stoppage, Herb Dean was on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani. He stated that maybe he made a mistake in terms of not being in position of seeing Uriah Faber's thumbs up. He claimed he didn't see it, and he saw Uriah Faber take damage, and he stopped the fight. Where Sarah McMahon, he stated that he saw her hurt from the liver shot, and he felt she couldn't defend herself in a reasonable amount of time. Do you have
1.1 seconds? Come on.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. He says that, you have to be defending yourself at all times. And I kind of agree with you, Jorge. At the same time, with combat sports is a little bit different. I think with Herb Dean, my gripe is that you need to be consistent. And I think you need to let the fighters know. It's kind of like in basketball. Either call it strictly or let the guys play. And I think with Herb Dean, he's been inconsistent, and you really don't know where your latitude is. I mean, the rules do not say you stop the fight when the guy's getting beat up a little. It's when the fighter cannot defend himself. And just because a person gets, put down for a second doesn't mean the fight's over. I think it's just very interesting to see Herb Dean's perspective. I mean, we've seen, the instance with Chuck Liddell and Rampage Jackson, where Chuck Liddell was knocked down for a second, and then he was knocked back unconscious, and then the fight was stopped. So it's a very gray area there, but I do agree with you, Jorge. I think Herb Dean made two big mistakes, and hopefully he'll learn from them. And real quickly, man, I just want to mention this. I saw a special on the NBA called Summer Dreams, and they talked about it was basically featuring all these prospects from the NBA, but they focused on one story about a female referee and the story that she had to go through. Like she had to work her way up from the minor leagues, from the NBA D League. She had to be evaluated from the head of the officials of the NBA. She had to get several auditions still this season to become an NBA ref. Like she's still currently auditioning to become an NBA ref. And I'm wondering if MMA should go through that same process of going through, a lot of fights before you become an official licensed referee. It just seems too easy right now to become a ref. And I'm not hating on Herb Dean, but I just think nowadays, mixed martial arts and boxing for that matter needs tougher standards. What's your thoughts on that?
No, and I completely agree. I mean, boxing has pretty strict standards as far as who the referees are, as far as how many amateur fights that you should do, how many lower fights you are to do. Of course, we have a lot of them that slip through the cracks, meaning it's just, boxing is a hell of a thing just because different regions of the country ref in such different ways. The East Coast refs, for example, will let fights go, whether people be, defending themselves or not. Let's say that Ronda Rousey and her last fight, let's say. If Ronda Rousey lands a liver shot, let's say Steve Smoger lets that fight go on for another 16 minutes.
He does.
It's just very different the way boxing is. And, if we can get just this centralized, outlook on refereeing, and it's very difficult just because of the fact it's the actual commissions from each state that assigns these. And I think that's where the biggest issue actually comes. A lot of these are well-qualified judges. They're extremely smart as well. Just because someone hasn't been in the UFC 2-3 years doesn't mean they're not allowed to do a championship fight. Maybe they did do an excellent job at the lower tier refereeing, but it's just because of that. You got to be exposed to each of the levels, and you got to earn your stripes like anything else, I think.
You do. I completely agree. We're scheduled to discuss UFC 171, but I am intrigued of what kind of rants you're going to have, Jorge, about Danny Garcia in his fight this past weekend. A little bit of a tougher brawl against, I believe, Mauricio Herrera. You said last week that this is going to be pretty much a cakewalk fight for Danny Garcia, if I remember that correctly.
And it was not.
No.
I was completely wrong. Mauricio Herrera went out there and proved me completely wrong. I paid too much attention to the Vegas odds where Herrera was as high as, I believe, a 7-8 to 1 underdog. and the guy won this fight despite the fact not getting the results. I thought it was a little closer than most people feel. I know there are a lot of people out there that had it 7 rounds to 5, 8 rounds to 4 for Mauricio Herrera. And I think, they were probably right. Herrera came in there as the underdog, was the better boxer that evening. But because Danny Garcia is, I guess, technically the house fighter, the fight was in Puerto Rico. He fought Herrera, who is a Mexican-American. Garcia is of Puerto Rican descent. He's not directly from there, but come on. He's the house fighter fighting on basically what is becoming his network, Showtime, and he's in line to potentially fight Floyd Mayweather down the line. Mm-hmm. Just everything was in this guy's favor, and it didn't help in the fight that there was open scoring in Puerto Rico to where we were able to see what happened at the end of the 4th round, what the judges had at the end of the 4th, at the end of the 8th, and the 12th. It's just unbelievable to me that, let's not forget, Showtime is the same network that put it's Canelo Alvarez up on the line last year against Mayweather. This guy was going to be their cash cow. Put him up on the line to get his first loss. And they say they're the network, and Golden Boy is more to blame, I think, for this situation. They claim to be the promoter that puts the fight that the fans want and will put their guys in danger. 2 guys last year, Canelo Alvarez and Adrian Broner. These were supposed to be the next 2 pay-per-view kings. They were put in tough contests, and it made the sport better because of it. The sport of boxing in 2013 was the best it's probably been in 17, 18 years.
Agreed.
And now for them to do this and do Mauricio Herrera the way they did, it sets the sport back a little bit for what it was able to accomplish in 2013.
You really think this? You really think so? That much? I'm surprised.
Not that much.
Yeah.
Let's just say it hurts it. Nonetheless, it hurts it. Danny Garcia, now that Canelo and Adrian Broner have lost, is the next guy that might potentially be the next pay-per-view guy. And for them to be just awarding these fights, and it's not necessarily an award. I thought it was a close fight, but I think Herrera did enough, like most of the American public that watched this fight. But it does hurt it a little for that credibility that it built in 2013 to be taken lightly here with this decision.
Is there more pressure on Danny Garcia, excuse me, and on Triple G, Gennady Golovkin? Now that you mentioned that Canelo lost, even Austin Trout, he lost. Certainly with Adrian Broner, is there more pressure on those guys? I know they're on 2 different, 2 different promotions, but is there more pressure on those guys now to kind of carry that mantle?
I think there is, especially because of that. And I think Canelo, he still has the potential there. But as I mentioned, the other guys, the 2 top guys in line, obviously lost. So for Triple G, there is a little bit of pressure there on that end. And I think the thing with Triple G is that he doesn't come from one of those top 2 promotions. So there's not as much pressure, I don't think, on him because it's not being put by Golden Boy or Top Rank because he's not signed to either promotion. But I think for Danny Garcia, there is a lot of pressure because ultimately a lot of people, based off of his performances last year, felt that he would be the next in line to possibly dethrone Floyd Mayweather.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to mention, too, Deontay Wilder. He looked phenomenal as usual. When do you think we'll see him in a serious fight? I mean, he's an impressive heavyweight. We've been kind of hyping him for the last year here. When do you think he gets a shot at, there's plenty of heavyweight belts. I mean, I'm sure he's ready to get one of them. I mean, when do you think he's in line to get some kind of a title shot here?
It's sooner. It has to be sooner rather than later. I mean, the guys, just think about it, Jay. The record is incredible. I mean, you haven't seen this type of record from a boxer, from a heavyweight boxer since maybe the mid to late 80s. 31 fights, 31 knockouts. Again, let me say that again. 31 fights, 31 knockouts. The most impressive thing about this that I bet most people don't know, he's never gone past the 4th round. I mean, if this were the 80s, he'd be Mike Tyson, the way Mike Tyson was dominated and just knocking people out in the 80s and early 90s. It's just unbelievable the power that he has. But the problem is he's not fighting anywhere near the competition that Mike Tyson was in the 90s, and it's about time they step it up. And I think and I hope that it's something like a fight against, maybe England's Tyson Fury. I think that would be an excellent fight to put him on the map. Fury has struggled with some of his fights, but guess what? The guy still hasn't lost a fight. 22-0 with 60 knockouts. He fights your favorite guy, Derek Chisora, here in July. So let's see.
Joy.
Let's see. Hopefully, late fall, a Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder fight goes down. I mean, neither guy has a world championship, but it's a big step forward in either guy's career for whoever would win that. And I think Deontay Wilder knocks him out within the first 4 rounds.
We have 15 minutes remaining, so I want to get to UFC 171. Certainly a bounce-back show for the promotion. Featured plenty of local talent, so let's focus on the local talent first. I guess since the fight, I would say, wasn't that competitive. Miles Jury versus Diego Sanchez. Jury looking spectacular, 30-27, 30-27, 29-28. Certainly the biggest win of his career. Certainly will move him up, at least fighting more, higher-ranked guys in the lightweight division. Is this a case of Jury just looking good because Diego Sanchez lacks technique, or do you think Miles Jury could be a guy to watch out for in the lightweight division?
The guy's undefeated. He's someone to watch, and he outclassed Diego Sanchez. He didn't just beat Diego Sanchez. He outclassed the hell out of him, man.
Agreed.
And that was difficult to watch, especially as a guy who picked, Jury to just get knocked out, and he proved me completely wrong. But he looked really well balanced, very technical. I mean, not super difficult to be able to showcase against a guy like Diego, who is very rock 'em, sock 'em, come forward. As long as you have decent footwork, I think you're able to outbox and hustle Diego from the outside, and Jury was able to do that. I mean, Sanchez never really landed the huge shot that you would think potentially knock him out. And I'm not sure if you saw this. Did you see Diego Sanchez blame what he had to eat before the fight, or he blamed food poisoning?
I did.
From steak. That was just very interesting for him to say that. And just looking at him, he wasn't the typical aggressive Diego that we're used to seeing. So, when it comes to excuses like this, I'm not the one to, usually I take him with a grain of salt, but there might be something to it just because of how he was in the cage that night.
Yeah, I just think he was 100%. And maybe, let's say we take him at his word and he really was sick. Maybe Diego hurts Jury, in the fight, but Jury is just picking him apart. He was.
Either way, we would have seen the same result, I think, just because of how good Jury looked.
The footwork, the movement, the jab, Jury was everywhere. Really, with Diego, I really don't like it when people say, oh, Diego Sanchez is a fighter that comes forward. When Diego Sanchez was in his prime, he took guys down. He went for submissions. He was much more of a well-rounded fighter. And now, I just think his game's – I don't know why he limits himself with his game. Like – there's, if I remember this correctly, really no urgency for the takedown, no urgency in the clinch. Diego Sanchez is a much better fighter than this coming forward in this taking punishment. I think, as you saw even with Guillermo Melendez, he's a guy who could scramble. I think he's much more talented in what he puts in the octagon sometimes, and Jury made him pay for it. Moving on, talking about Tyron Woodley defeating Carlos Condit, round 2. I think we both agree that Tyron Woodley nailed Condit with some huge shots in round 1. He probably won that round. Round 2, Carlos Condit seemed like he was starting to turn the tide somewhat. And then on a takedown, it seemed like he hurt his knee. Joe Rogan pointed out that he was screaming in pain. I believe the fight was stood back up. And it seemed like Carlos Condit was okay. And then Tyron Woodley, like you mentioned earlier, Jorge, kicked him in the opposite leg. Condit went down in pain, and the fight was over. I guess a lot of people are comparing this fight to the Chris Weidman injury to Anderson Silva. I'm in the camp of believing that Chris Weidman won that fight against Anderson because of the kick to check in at the leg, and the leg hit the shin, causing Anderson Silva's leg to break. Here, do you give Woodley 100% of the victory here? Do you think it was his takedown that injured Carlos Condit, or do you think this was a freak accident and Tyron Woodley should be thankful that the fight ended in the fashion that it did?
No, just because of what you actually said. He initiated the takedown that initially injured the knee. He initiated the leg kick that ultimately finished the knee, that same knee. So I think he deserves a lot of credit for him to be able to work, to break down his opponent, and that's exactly what he did against Carlos Condit. So I think he deserves all the credit for having this fight stopped, and just because of Jay, it was two different moves that ended up causing this injury: the takedown and then a kick. So I think Woodley deserves all respect for being able to actually win this fight, and for anything else to come out, I think it's a disrespect to him. And he was winning the fight at the time that the stoppage took place. I definitely think so. It just sucks that this goes down as a KO or TKO on Carlos Condit's record. He had never been stopped that form before, so it's just, I guess it's kind of, it was bitter. It was not necessarily bittersweet, but it was just difficult to see that, the best fighter to ever come out of the state be injured like that.
I don't know. I don't know. It's kind of weird. Like, I can believe a leg check because that happens in Muay Thai, and Chris Weidman did lift his knee. But how many times do we see guys blow out their ACL on a takedown like that?
Yeah.
Like, is that really Woodley's intention of the takedown, is to blow the guy's ACL?
No,
like,
and I don't know if that ever is the case, unless you're Bill Goldberg in the late 90s for WCW.
Right? Exactly.
I mean, that's the only thing that I would think. But the potential of a takedown is to try to get your opponent down and eventually put the hurt on him. But
sure,
I just think that he deserves credit because a maneuver and moves and attacks that he implemented ended up causing the injury. It's not like Condit was the one initiating the kick that hurt his own knee. Example, like Anderson Silva, despite the fact that Weidman was playing defense. So I guess that might not be the best, comparison for that. Sure. But I think because of the fact he was initiating the maneuvers, he should get credit for it.
Since we only have 8 minutes remaining, I want to move on and talk about the main event. Johnny Hendricks defeating Robbie Lawler 48-47, 48-47, 48-47. In terms of the actual end score, wasn't controversial, but one judge did score his scorecard round 2, 10-8 for, I believe, Johnny Hendricks, and then he scored round 5, 10-10. A bizarre scorecard. I believe, Jorge, you had Robbie Lawler winning round 2, right?
Yep, which surprises the hell out of me that it was 10-8. I mean, a lot of people I think I've heard most people say that round 1 was a close fight, round for them. For whatever reason, when I watched it, round 2 to me seemed a little bit closer than the first round. But I mean, I guess I'd have to go back to actually watch the fight again. But I did give Lawler second, third, and fourth. But again, the first and second round I thought was close. So I can deal with Johnny Hendricks winning by a point in this fight, especially because guess what? The UFC kind of owed him one also. I know the judges really don't, think about that when they do, but I think there should be, I mean, you got to live up to the scorecards. I hope the UFC and Joe Rogan kind of put these judges on blast the way Max Kellerman does with boxing on HBO. Just say, hey, this guy had a ridiculous card in this fight, and the card tonight is ridiculous. Because for you to score 10-10, I completely understand. But you said it was a 10-10 the 5th round they scored that?
That's insane.
Johnny
Hendricks won that round.
He dominated. He dominated that round. Yeah. I mean, Lawler was gassed when it came down to the last 3.5 minutes of that round. So, I mean, for that judge to have those type of scorecards it's just stupidity, to be honest. Yeah. I mean, it just eventually you do have a respect for the tough job that these judges have, but when it comes to scores like that on rounds that were obvious, meaning the second round was somewhat competitive, and 1 point should have been the difference there, not 2. And then for the 5th round to be as dominant by Hendricks, and then for you to give it a draw, you're just a freaking idiot at that point.
Yep. The judge's name is Doug Crosby. Crosby had the first round for Johnny Hendricks. He had the second round 10-8 for Johnny Hendricks. He had rounds 3 and 4 for Robbie Lawler, and in the 5th round he had 10-10. That's insane. That's borderline criminal. That's a disgrace. It is.
I mean, so what would have happened? He scores the fight 10-8, then he would have the match even. Is that correct?
I'm looking at the actual. His scorecard, he actually printed it out here. I'm looking at the actual raw data here, and it's round 1, 10-9 for Hendricks, round 2, 10-8. That's what I'm looking at here. And that's what the report says from MMA Junkie. 10-8 for Johnny Hendricks. And then rounds 3 and 4, both for Robbie Lawler, with round 5 being scored 10-10.
So he would have had an even fight if he would have scored it correctly. Either way, Johnny Hendricks wins the fight because of a majority decision. But my goodness, sure. I mean, not to take away from this fight was phenomenal. I mean,
yes.
If I had to compare it, I felt like I was watching, guys exchange huge shots. It was Brandon Rios, Mike Alvarado on a little slower level just because of the shots that the two guys were actually trading. It's unbelievable. The chin that both guys demonstrated, and just, I mean, I'd like to say that the precision punching or the just striking of these guys were pretty good, but let's not get it twisted. These guys don't have the best head movements ever, but
they don't.
Johnny Hendricks, we've never really seen his chin tested until this fight, and my goodness, can that beard hold up?
I agree. With 4 minutes remaining, I just want to say this. It's an unbelievable performance by Robbie Lawler. I know, when time goes on, I don't think Robbie Lawler's going to get too much credit for this fight. This is incredible. This guy, we're talking about a man who is written off as a serious competitor in the top 15 in the welterweight division. And to put on a fight in which a lot of people thought Johnny Hendricks beats George St. Pierre, and Robbie Lawler comes and almost beats Johnny Hendricks, who pretty much, there was no kind of injury to my knowledge before this fight. He seemed fine. Hendricks fought pretty well, and Robbie Lawler took him to the limit. I think Robbie Lawler should be proud of himself. And I think this is a shining example of his work. I think he doesn't really lose anything in this fight. If anything, this is a renaissance for him. And I'm really proud of him. I've never felt so really impressed by a fighter really not being a true fan of his. And I think Robbie Lawler will always have my respect. It's an unbelievable performance by him.
And guess what? The UFC voters, or the individuals who vote for the rankings, felt the same way you did. He's moved up to number 1 contender after that fight. So Robbie Lawler won. McDonald moved up to 2. Carlos Condit dropped to number 3. Woodley moved up 7 spots, and now he is at number 4. So what happens next in this division? I have no idea. Does Woodley fight Lawler? What happens? Is it Lawler McDonald? Is it Woodley Hendricks next? I mean, they could do a lot of interesting things with those 4 guys, I think.
Yeah, it depends on, I think Willie has some kind of injury. Not Willie, excuse me, Hendricks has, I think, an injury, so that will have to be taken care of. But certainly tons of guys in the welterweight division, but not a lot of stars. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully this pay-per-view, I mean, in terms of the actual attendance, it's the biggest North American, it's the biggest gate and biggest attendance in the United States for the UFC. I think for even MMA. So that's a huge crowd. Really, no one's talking about that. So clearly, despite Johnny Hendricks being kind of the hometown guy, to be a huge draw, that's huge. I mean, that's a big deal. I don't care where you're from. So hopefully the pay-per-view numbers reflect that. 2 minutes remaining here. Real quickly, do you have a prediction for the rematch? People say it's one of the greatest fights in the history of mixed martial arts. Dan Henderson taking on Shogun Rua. Both guys a little bit older, fighting on a Sunday. That's 5 o'clock Mountain Time, 7 o'clock Eastern Time for the main card. The rest of the card, not really too much to write home about. CB Dollaway's on this card, Fabio Maldonado, Hani Jason. Diego Brandao is going to be on the undercard in the prelims. That starts 3 p.m. Mountain Time. Dan Henderson, Shogun. Dan Henderson can't use TRT. What's your thoughts on this fight? Who do you have winning? Real quickly.
I have Shogun winning this. I'm not sure how it's going to happen. I don't know if Henderson gasses out or if it's a decision, but I think, Henderson needs this victory. They both need it pretty badly, but Shogun is coming off, three straight losses, and Rua is they're both getting up in age, man. So I'm going to go Shogun via unanimous decision, just because he's the only one coming off a victory, and it was a KO. So I think Shogun does outwork Henderson and gets the unanimous decision.
Quickly, Kareem Mayfield, our guest we had 2 weeks ago, fighting this weekend, HBO, Thomas Durham. Please go check that fight out. Kareem Mayfield, if he continues on his career path, it's going to be a huge star. Episode 183 of The Low Blow, you've been listening to it on SouthwestFight.com, USCombatSports.com, and Fight Fans Radio. We will see you next week. See you later, Jorge. See you next week.
Peace.